Okay, hello all. This is the lockdown edition of this panel. We wish that we all could have been there with you at NZGDC, but you all know what happened. So before we start off, we acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of our land, Australia. Stefano, Ashley and myself are coming to you from the place we now call Sydney. The Gadigal of the Eora Nation are the traditional custodians of this place. Liam is joining us from where we now know as Melbourne, which the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation are the traditional custodians of. So welcome to How to Pivot Painlessly. So fittingly, given the circumstances for this panel, this is a panel all about change. So I'm going to give you kind of the problem statement that we're going to talk about today. So games, as we know, are creative projects with technical and financial limitations in a fast-moving market. So by their nature, they're developed in what we will politely call dynamic environments, where the one constant is change. So despite this inevitability of change, pivots within a project can still be incredibly destabilizing, and they can really wreak havoc on a team and also on a business. So most game devs have been in the situation where it feels like an outsider or a really senior person just kind of swoops in and pivots their project for mysterious or ill-advised reasons. I think that that's a scenario that a lot of people would be familiar with, even if you haven't experienced it personally. We've all heard about it. So in this panel, we want to talk about why this happens and how teams can handle the pain of pivoting. We don't have a moderator today. We figured if you put 4 production people in a Zoom call, it will just organise itself. So I'm going to be asking questions and I'll also be answering some of them. But before we get started, I'm going to go around and introduce ourselves. So we're going to tell you our names, our jobs, and in 5 words or less, what we think when we hear the word pivot. So we're going to start with Liam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that, Ali. My name's Liam Asler. I'm the Managing Director at Summerfall Studios here in Melbourne. And I had 2 answers to this and I couldn't decide between them. The first one, of course, is like, so I've got an idea. The second one is, how will we make this work?
I hate both of them. So I'm Ali McLean. I'm the senior producer at Mktng, and I'm also the founder of the Working Lunch Collective, which is a collection of initiatives all about just making the games industry a little bit of a better place to work. And in 5 words or less, what pivot means to me, I think clear my schedule is what comes to mind. Anything I thought I was going to get done is not happening this week, at least. So Stefano, what does it mean to you?
So, well, I'm Stefano Marticic. I'm the Wargaming Sydney Development Manager and Agile Coach. And pivot for me means that it's time for our delivery structure to prove itself.
Ooh, that's a good one. And Ash?
Oh, well, yeah, I'm a producer at Wargaming Sydney as well. So for me, when I hear pivot, I go, I'm ready, and I get into a mode where no one can stop me. So I usually put on 80s hip hop music, get in the zone, and just go guns blazing, whatever direction this pivot might take us.
That's a good attitude. That's the kind of producer that you want on your team, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so as just demonstrated, pivot can mean many, many different things to different people. So I guess I'd like to start by talking about what kind of spectrum we're talking about. So let's be positive. Let's look at the best case scenario. Does anyone have an example or a hypothetical of the kind of impact a good pivot can have on a team?
I think Ash should go first.
Thank you, Liam. So at least from my side, we've had some pivots that were minor but positive. So where we wanted to go in a certain direction, originally they didn't want to go that way, but now eventually they've come to the realization, cool, this is where we want to go. So at least from our side, we get really excited and we're like, cool, we know we have to drop everything, change a huge amount of code, but it's actually going to be towards the goal that we wanted. It's going to be a good experience for the player. So that's at least something that I've experienced, which is the best case scenario, I would hope.
And Liam, did you have something?
Yeah, Mine was very similar, but essentially, like, obviously there's such a difference in scale with pivots, and I think that it's a lot easier to make small scale pivots effectively than large ones. Some of the large ones I've been involved with have been art related, weirdly enough, and have been where the effective ones have been where the pivot comes from the team, and it's everyone acknowledging that there's a problem. And then the team being like, okay, we need to, like, here are all the options. Here's what we can do. Here's the solution we think best. And then the executive saying like, okay, this is the one that we're going to do. And everyone just setting aside what they were doing before, working quickly and efficiently to sort of find the best way to move forward, and sort of doing everything with a minimum of disruption.
Mm-hmm. And Stefano, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, for me, actually, when a pivot happens, small or big, I know for a fact that the majority of people are going to be focused on what is changing in the product and what the pivot actually is. Whereas I need to be very focused on, is this pivot impacting our values, our principles? And that's what we have to avoid. So be wary of small changes, because actually they can impact where they shouldn't.
That's a really good point. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the worst case scenarios on the flip side of, small changes, values-based changes coming from the team. These are all really positive things, but this is a panel about how to pivot painlessly, which does suggest the existence of very painful pivots. We are going to talk about that soon, but firstly, let's talk a little bit about roles and perspectives that are involved in a pivot. So all of us here today, as much as we all kind of work on the production side of things, so we're not going to be talking about the actual implementation detail and the development work that goes into a pivot, which is nothing to be scoffed at, particularly when it comes to like architectural changes or huge art pipeline changes. That's a different panel. For us, we're just going to talk about the roles that we as production people have in a massive change or a small change happening on a project. So we had to talk about this before the panel. Here's one we prepared earlier. We have a list of roles that we think we all have played or currently play in game projects that are experiencing change. So we've identified 4. We've got the pivoter, and this we're assigning to Liam, sort of the executive, like stakeholder perspective. This is someone who's really in charge of a pivot in the most sort of traditional sense of what it means to be in charge of something. And then we have the challenger. So this is me. This is the kind of role that I usually take on. This is someone that's kind of at the layer between the executives and stakeholders and the team that needs to start planning that pivot. And then we have the coordinator. So this is Stefano. And Stefano's going to tell you all about the details of this, but this is really how we're going to execute on this as a business, as a team, and as a structure. And then we have the actioner. So this is Ash. So this is the person who is on the ground with the team making this pivot happen. Really the person, I think, who feels a lot of the brunt of, if this is not a great pivot, how the team is feeling about it, and the whole, the person who's really responsible for the morale as well. So there's all really crucial roles in a pivot. So to dive deep into those, we're all going to tell you a little bit about our specific role, what it means to us, the kind of challenges that we come up against. So let's start with Liam. Tell us all about what it's like to be the pivoter.
Right. So as the sort of the managing director of Summerfall, like my job is to be the executive. Like the buck stops with me. I'm the one who's ultimately responsible for decision making, and oftentimes sort of things will sort of filter their way up to me in order for a final decision to be made. So regardless of whether a pivot comes from me or comes from the team, I'm the one who has to make the call. So sort of as MD, but also as the pivoter, my job is to sort of monitor the high level status of the business and all projects, be across all of that and have a clear picture of the sum of all parts, so that I can see when there are problems and when there are significant issues. And there are lots of different reasons for a pivot and ways that a pivot can go. But roughly speaking, there are 3 groups, one of which is sort of external pressures, which is budget, ship date, partner requirements. There's internal pressures like the schedule or the team changing, market, and then finally like market pressures. So like commercial needs, platform needs, changing design norms, etc. And my job is sort of to evaluate each of these as the project progresses and work with the team to sort of determine what's best for them in the project, depending on our values and requirements. Sometimes this might involve significant changes for a project, which requires a pivot. Ideally, I don't make this decision in a vacuum. In fact, that should never happen. It should never happen that an executive makes a pivot decision in a vacuum. Unfortunately, it is more common than not. I think we've all been there and we've all seen lots of examples of that. But my job is to sort of gather information and data from team stakeholders and use that to inform decision-making. So if after talking to stakeholders, it's like clear that a pivot or a change needs to take place, I work with them to plan the pivot. My job's not to tell them what to do or tell them how to do the pivot, but to sort of help shepherd things because I have that high level business view. That requires buy-in. It means that the whole team has to be on board with the change, and which is why working with the team throughout the process, so they're agentic and they have made decisions themselves, is really important, because otherwise my decisions don't matter. So as I mentioned earlier, like a lot of the pivots I've been a part of have been significant art changes. So we've seen that a couple of times in Chorus, again, that I'm working on right now, where the art style has changed pretty significantly from one iteration to another for varying reasons. And normally that decision-making process for me sort of goes something like this. It starts with seeing a problem on the horizon. I verify that problem with the team and start gathering data, and then project that data out with the team, gauge everyone's temperature, get opinions, gather information, get buy-in, then make a call based on all of that, working with the team. Then my job from there is simply to support the team, to find new solutions and ensure that they help us reach the goal that we've collectively decided.
I'm interested, maybe this is me kind of showing my hand in terms of the kind of challenger that I am, but I'm interested in kind of what the emotional experience is like. And when we're talking about how to pivot painlessly, it doesn't just mean for the team. I think it also should mean for our executives and the health of our executives. Like, we need people like you to be mentally healthy and to be happy at work in order to lead in a meaningful way. So what is it like for you, like when you're in the kind of situations you're describing, you're seeing problems on the horizon, you're having to get all this buy-in, you're doing this kind of gathering collection kind of work, which is kind of out of sync with what everybody else is doing. What's that experience like for you as a person?
It's pretty lonely. Like, it can be really hard because sometimes you're the only person who has the perspective that you do. And that's like, not to say that like, oh, being a business owner is so shit, it's so hard, my life is so difficult. It's not, but being the person who has to constantly watch out for the high level, try to see the ships on the horizon, is stressful. And often, ideally, I, more than almost anyone else, understand the impact that a decision has on the team. I know that if we decide to change what tooling we're using, I know that that's going to create a whole bunch of disruption. It's going to be really hard for the team. That sucks. Like, those decisions suck. They're awful to have to make. But ultimately, like, that's my job, and I can make that less bad, both for myself and for the whole team, by being super communicative throughout the whole process and making sure that everyone is on board. So it's often not fun. It's not a fun position to be in, but it's also how I can contribute to the team and help make the business and the projects become the best that they can be. If that role didn't exist, you might have chunked or separated perspectives, but you might not have like that high level apex perspective.
Yeah. Is there anything that the people around you, whether it be on your team now or like examples you've seen in other teams, is there anything that people around you can do to make that process suck less?
Honestly, for me, and I don't know if this is a me thing or like a common thing, but I really like to be challenged. I want people to come to me and be like, why this? How did you come to this conclusion? Like, have you thought this all the way through? Because as the person in charge, sometimes people are really intimidated, and they think that the things that I say, are law. And while sure, if at the end of the day, I'm like, yes, what I say goes, technically speaking, that's going to be the case. But most of the time, I'm still operating as a human being. Like I'm flawed and I come at it with bias and from a different perspective. So for me personally, I really want to surround myself with people who will interrogate what I'm doing, not in an awful, rude, adversarial way, but in order to help make the best decisions. That genuinely makes my job so much better, because then I know it's not just me, it's other smart people too.
You've set me up really nicely to lead into the challenger, which is the role that I'm taking on. Thank you for that, Liam. So I'm a senior producer. The titles have been like expert product manager and like various other wanky things that people use to try and describe this type of work. And typically what this means is that I'm in a position, usually I'm still working directly with the dev team, but I'm also spending a lot of time talking to executives and stakeholders. And that can take lots of different configurations. So typically I'm the kind of person that would be talking to someone like Liam about why did you make that decision and what's the data behind it, and making sure that information is flowing both ways, both to the team and also from the team. And sometimes that could be like from the production team, not necessarily from the dev team. There's lots of different levers that can be pulled in that situation. And to your point, Liam, I would say that kind of challenger is an interesting word, because it sounds like by default, I'm going to challenge everything that happens. And kind of, yes, like kind of I will. And the reason for that is not necessarily about taking an adversarial position. Hopefully most of the time that's not required. My approach to this would be to be very driven by empathy for everybody involved, and try to foster decision-making that is more driven by values than it is driven by like new ideas and new things that might appear on the horizon. Because realistically, I think on any project at any stage in development, there is a major change that could be made. There's always new information. There's always a change in the market. There's always new technology. You always lose someone crucial in the team that needs to be replaced by someone else who has a new idea about how something can be done. Like these things always happen. But ultimately, if you can develop kind of strong values, whether it be around your company or around your project, around your team, and try and filter your decision-making through that value set, it gives me something to work with. It gives me a framework for a conversation, both with the team and with the executive and the stakeholders. So typically when a pivot actually happens, if I think about the work that I do, I kind of wasn't joking when I said clear my calendar, because it does start by like, okay, I need mental space to think about what this means. Usually that is like not just me sitting and thinking about what it means. It's like going and talking to people like Ash, talking to people like Liam, talking to people like Stefano, trying to get a picture of what's your perspective on this, how is this going to affect you, what information is out there about this at the time. If I'm being very honest, my initial perspective is always going to be very informed by my knowledge of the pivoter as a person. Are they the kind of person, the kind of stakeholder who's always coming up with a new idea? Do they always want to pivot? Do they always get excited about things? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Like that energy can be really helpful for building momentum and making creative decisions and innovating, but it also does need to be handled in a different way to somebody who is only going to make a change when it absolutely has to happen. Also like their emotional state. So are they under pressure right now? Is the company maybe not doing so well? Have we not got the funding that we thought we were going to get? How are they feeling about the project in general? Do they feel included? Are they part of the conversation? Because sometimes you see people try and make change when they're trying to get their mark on something. And so being able to read people, understand their emotional state and see how that might be affecting a change is a huge part of my job. And so maintaining these kind of connections and relationships with people is really important in being able to play that challenger role, because you need to have trust and you need to be able to have candid conversations with someone like Liam about where something's coming from. I can stop referring to you, Liam, when I use bad examples.
Look, I've been guilty of all of those things, right? I think that's the reality, is like, while it's very easy for us to talk about the best case scenario, at some stage we're all going to fall into bad habits. That's why these roles exist. It's why we're doing the panel, right? So yeah, Ali, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Say it like, let's have a hypothetical scenario. So I come to you and I'm like, hey, this game just came out and it has the same mechanics as us. I think that we need to change our core USP. I'm convinced this is the case. And what could I do as the sort of the executive to make my case to you? And how do I help you to challenge me, if that makes sense, and make sure that I'm in the right space?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. So I think if someone's coming to me and they're saying, I want to fundamentally change the nature of the product that we're making, I really strongly believe that this is what we should do. I'm not going to come at you with like a hard brick wall no, even though that may be how I feel. I think it would start with like coming to me with what is our first step to exploring and validating how you feel. So how you feel is important. It's not something that we're going to write off just because it's a feeling, but because how you feel as a professional and as someone who's in your position is coming from all the years of experience and knowledge that you have being the person that you are. And obviously, if I work with you, I respect you and hopefully I trust you. But also I want to work through how do we interrogate and validate through some kind of factual means. And if it's something about like changing the game mechanic due to a competitor title, there are avenues that we can explore for that. So do we need to do more user research? Do we need to test the materials that we have? Like, can we get a focus group together of our target demographic and look at comparing this title with the title that we're making, get them to play it, see if they see enough fundamental difference, or do they just say, well, this is League of Legends. So I think there are ways to validate. And as long as you're open to the idea that we do need to validate in ways other than just how you feel, in order, A, for the product to be successful, but, B, for the team to trust the decisions that we're making and to get buy-in from all the people we need to get buy-in from, then I'd be happy with that. Great. So that's kind of me. As Liam said, it's not always going to be that I have a pivoter who's going to be really open and flexible and willing to explore things with me. And sometimes the best I could hope for is an honest conversation about a change that I just don't agree with. But even that, the honesty is enough to be able to then take that information. I really know where the decision is coming from and then go to the group of people who need to coordinate the change. So speaking of coordination, Stefano, tell us about being a coordinator.
Yeah, and actually speaking of relationships and honesty and trusting, that's where really my work starts. Not with the pivot, but months before. And having those relationships in place. So it's really important that when the pivoter, the challenger, they speak, and I can really trust that everybody has done their due diligence and the details are there. And then it's just about the execution. So a big part is preparing for it because it will happen, a pivot, small or big. And it's all about setting up a group that is able to navigate such situations. So that if I do a good job, a small pivot, let's say, will feel just as work as usual. A big pivot, it will not completely destroy us. So for me, the answer in these years has always been really Scrum as a delivery practice and as a delivery framework to focus on that potential increment each sprint, to focus on validating our hypothesis each sprint, and having the regular backlog refinements that enable us to understand where are we going. And if all of this is in place, pivot time is just a moment to say if we construct a great group that can pivot.
I love that. I mean, it's about let's have these foundations in place. Let's be serious about our structure. Let's be serious about our process because it's going to protect us when these things inevitably do happen, right?
Yes, absolutely. You have to start as soon as possible, and that's where you have to put the majority of your focus because, as we all know, pivots are going to happen, distractions are going to happen. So the most important bit is really focusing on your practices and making sure that the people that are with you are all in line and really bought into what you're doing.
I want to ask you about what happens when you don't have those structures in place, but I know that we're going to talk about worst case scenario in a moment, so I'm sure that you'll bring it up then. Okay, so that's the perspective of the coordinator. Then Ash, as the actioner, taking into account everything that everyone else is doing. What is this role about? What is it about being sort of in there with the team?
So being the actioner, there's a lot of stuff that goes through your head. You hear pivot, you're like, all right, what do we do? Where do we go? At least from my side, I think the biggest thing is, how is this going to impact the team? How are they going to respond? And how can we protect them so they don't have to worry about all these things? Because I think most people being here thinking pivot, there's a lot of things that haven't been thought through, haven't been decided. So it's really thinking about, all right, which parts can I pass to the team? What's appropriate knowledge for them? Something that I've always loved about the role is you can be clear and transparent with your team, which is fantastic. It's perfect when you come to a pivot because you can honestly have that conversation, but then also understanding how much is too much. So I think from an actioner point of view, you should give them the heads up. You should say, this is the lay of the land. But then in the background, you're there trying to work with the person causing the pivot. So usually your exec or whoever has kind of come through for this, and then really discuss, all right, what are the effects of this? How do we plan for it? What do we need to do? I think being able to do that planning kind of async from the team helps a lot because it reduces the stress from them. And that's my main priority, is keeping a happy team means you're going to have a lovely product at the end of it. So once I've kind of gathered a plan, figured out, all right, this is roughly what we want to look at doing, it's when you start pulling in some of the people in the team, make sure that that plan is a good space for you to move forward, and then present it to the team. So it's really about kind of harnessing your little family. Your team is your gold. They're bringing and delivering this experience for your players. So I guess as much safety as you can give them is really great.
That's so true. And hopefully that structure that Stefano was talking about gives you that buffer and that cushioning. You've got enough planning and value stuff right now for people to work on. So as you said, you can get into the asynchronous planning of what comes next. You said something really interesting at the start of that, which is there's so much stuff that hasn't been thought through and hasn't been worked out by the time a pivot comes to you. And I think that is so true. We're also talking about totally different things. When Liam and I are talking about like what is the strategy and what are the aspects and what's the data that's feeding into this and what's the research that's been done, that's often so separate from the actual development reality of the project as well. But Jessica is the only person who knows how this set of blueprints work and often can become like a major blocker to the entire pivot. And so having that good relationship with someone who's in that actioner position is so powerful. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So we've talked about sort of our roles. We've talked about what pivoting means to us. Now we're going to talk about the landscape within this pivot group. So I would love to hear about worst case scenarios just for my own edification, but also I would love to hear about kind of processes, things that you do as a professional that equip you to navigate a pivot. So either some best practices or a specific situation that you've been in. I'd love to hear about that. Maybe, Stefano, maybe you could, because I was really interested to hear from you about when you don't have all that structure in place, when you don't have like a great implementation of Scrum, for example.
Okay.
How does the coordinator step in? What kind of practical things can you do?
Well, change is hard and scary for everyone. So it's really important that we respect our people. And the most important respect bit is that knowledge workers are really motivated by purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Don't hit those three kind of things. And this just to give guidelines. So if a change has to happen, that's fine, but let's not cut on these things. And the other bit, a little bit more pragmatical, is pivoting is changing, and somebody in the organization, hopefully multiple people, would be well versed with a proven change model, at least knowing what's going on. I usually use ADKAR, that's the acronym, and basically you need to make sure that the awareness is there. So make sure that people are aware of why are we changing, what is to change about. Then each individual needs to have a desire to contribute towards the change. And here it's the relationship of their manager that really plays a big role. And people need to have the knowledge to change and ability to change. And the last very important bit is there is the reinforcement bit. When you've done the pivot, you should have a little bit of time to be able to reinforce the pivot. And if you find yourself in a situation in which, oh no, the next pivot already kicked in before I did the reinforcement bit, that's an alarm bell. No team will be able to support 3 pivots in 3 months. So watch out for that.
Yeah. Could you repeat that acronym?
ADKAR. ADKAR.
And what are the words again?
It's awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and the last one, really, there's the reinforcement of the change. Don't change too much.
That's great. That's really helpful. Anyone else have anything about like a worst case scenario or any processes or tools that help you mitigate those disasters?
Well, at least from my side, so we're busy doing a AAA game at the moment. So as you can imagine, going into a production phase, there are many decisions to be made, and of course, there could be the odd pivot or two. So we've had some lovely experiences lately where we have gone through a planning phase. We've been very on top of what we want to do. So from my team, we're working on a feature set. We've designed it out. We've started the wireframes. We're good to go. We know what we're doing this sprint. So we jump into sprint planning and we get completely different requests come through. So I sit there going, right, I need to tell the team, this is what we're doing in the next 2 weeks, knowing that there's this completely separate piece of work that's come through that's going to change everything that we're about to work on. So that's my worst case during a sprint planning. How I tackled that is at least hopefully graceful or could help other people when they hit the same problem. So from my side, I guess what I ended up doing was instead of going into that panic mode and going, oh my God, like, what do I change? What do I do? We just need to get this done. I ended up going and working through, all right, what's some of those requirements that I know we need? And what from our plan that we already have can we kind of salvage that we know we will need it no matter what? So I guess that's kind of part of the pre-planning phase. If you just get it in, don't just jump on it straight away because it's just going to cause so much confusion to the team. It's happened before with other people where, you want to action it, you know what they want, it's going to be worthwhile potentially. But I guess the thing is take your time. Don't cause that panic for the team, because if you come across panic, you're like, all right, we need to change it, but you don't know what you're changing. It's not going to help anyone. So I guess from my side, the framework that you need to work through is understand what's come through. What can you keep working on while you work out the next plan? And then there's nothing wrong with meeting your team midway and then having another planning session. There's so many chances during the 2 weeks that you can have a conversation, you can start planning and pulling things in. I think that's kind of the key thing for me is just don't panic, everything will be all right. How do we change things so that we can accommodate said pivot without freaking everyone out?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I when you're talking about don't panic, it makes me think of like early in my career being in a similar situation to what you're describing and feeling the structure of Scrum and feeling like I have to solve this problem with the team within this sprint planning session, and not thinking outside of the structure that, hey, that structure doesn't exist to stop you from making good decisions. Like not taking a beat like you're saying and saying, all right, we're going to do half of this now, half of it later when we have more of the information. I think it's, staying cool-headed when you're in that actioner role is so important for the morale of the team. Does anyone have anything else? Any other worst-case scenarios or processes?
Two quick ones, one of which is from a pivoter perspective, which is actually like a me problem. If I'm not listening, then everything's fucked. So the pivoter has to be able to listen to the team and really understand what is going on. I have a habit personally of like, I know a lot of things about a lot of different parts of game development. And that means that I have a partial understanding of many things in game development, because last time I did that was probably like 6 years ago. So that tends to give me a false sense of confidence in the way that I'm planning. And I'm like, yeah, well, I understand how this works. And the reality is 90% of the time, I have no idea. Like, things move very quickly. And while I might have understood 5 years ago, that is no longer the case. So making sure that I listen is crucially important. And then sort of as having obviously been the non-pivoter lots of times, the worst case scenario has often been when the pivoter and then the rest of the team aren't on the same page. It's for forcing a team to do something that they don't want to do, especially when it's necessary, is virtually impossible. It creates an extremely toxic environment very quickly, and it can take even wonderful teams to really bad places within weeks. So that's why, like, I tend to be very, very passionate about making sure that, you know, everyone is spoken with, everyone has an opportunity for input and to contribute and to feel like they're agentic in the process, because otherwise it does just feel like some random executive being like, hey, we need to do this. And then there not being a clear explanation of why, nobody has any input, and it's just a mess.
Yeah. Someone coming in and saying, make everything green for no reason. Yeah, it's not a good feeling. Great. Okay, we have a bit less than 10 minutes left, and we have 2 questions to get through, so let's move a little bit quickly. Stefano, you kind of touched on this before, but knowing the breadth of your experience in this area, I'd love to hear more from you about this. We have talked about our key players, our processes, the kinds of scenarios we work through, but none of this matters if we're not taking into account the real emotional aspect of this. You know, how does it feel to be someone on a team experiencing a pivot, whether it's good or bad? Could you talk us through a little bit about how do people feel when change happens?
Yeah, so typically people react to change as a like, why not? Because it didn't come within that person the majority of the time. So we really need to play along the lines of hopefully we build a good team that has good relationship throughout. And at that point, it's really only the case when really you need your manager that you believe that has the best interest for you and walk you through it and try to really make the things from an optic where people care, which at the end it's themselves, their career, what they're doing, the bit that they were putting in that piece of work, and give that time. Don't think that use an exec and pivoters and challenger, people take 2 weeks to make a decision, then off you go. It should be the other way around. 2 days to get your duck in rows, and then give 2 weeks for the entire team to have a run of like, why, how come right now? So that's the biggest thing that I would say.
Yeah, I think that's such a good advice. I would love a poster of that where it's like, spend this much time making the decision and this much time having people work through it.
Yeah,
that's great. Awesome, thank you. So, okay, so to summarize, just to wrap up, I'd love to hear from everybody the one piece of advice that you would give to somebody in a similar position to you, whether it be the kind of role, the kind of studio, the kind of project that you're working on, about what to do when they're facing a pivot. So let's start with Ash.
Yeah, I guess my biggest one, and I mentioned it before, is just don't panic. You have actually more time than you might give yourself grace for. So just take some time, work through it in your mind. I think, Ali, you had a great point of like, clear my schedule. So, you know, really take the time to think through it. And that's just going to give you a lot of ability to have that conversation with your team and give them the reassurance that they're going to need as well. Yeah,
definitely. Liam, what about you?
I think mine would be like, is the pivot necessary? A lot of the times, you know, in my position, it can feel like the world is ending a lot. And so really interrogating that impulse and making sure that it's validated with data is crucially important. And it's important not to overreact. I think probably one of the biggest things that my co-founder Dave has taught me over the past couple of years has been, sometimes feedback comes in or things happen, and you need to take the time to really interrogate that rather than sort of react immediately, because overreacting is often worse than not doing anything.
Very, very true. Steffo, what is your advice for someone facing a pivot?
For me, it's absolutely work from day one to be prepared for it. It will come, many will come. So your delivery framework will save you or kill you.
It's grim.
It's true.
It's so
It is
true.
Prepared.
Yeah, and I think it's weird to ask myself the question and answer it, but I will. My advice would be kind of similar to yours, which is go into every team and every project assuming that you are going to come up against that worst case scenario. And what can I do to lay the framework to make sure that we're equipped to handle that, whether it be, really investing in those relationships, really investing in building that trust, whether it be being agile in the way that we're talking about our scheduling, whether it be making sure that we understand why decisions are made even at a very small scale so that we can scale that process to bigger things. All of those things you should be expecting that you're going to need to really rely on them in your time of need. So very similar to what you were saying, Stefano, be prepared. Big shocker coming from production people. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for being part of this panel. And thank you to the people watching this. We hope that this has been useful to you and that you've learned something about the change that looms on the horizon for you. And hopefully this helps you approach it in a more healthy, painless way, and enjoy the rest of your NZGDC. Bye.
Hey, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
And thanks, Ali.
Only a couple minutes, so I'm just going to read through one of them first. Chris Winning asks, have you ever had to pivot in a direction that you didn't personally believe in? How did you inform or persuade the team to follow the new direction?
Oh God, way too many times to count. Ali, I think that you've probably got some good stories about this.
Oh, wow, okay. I remember first a bit. But yeah, I definitely have had to be part of changes that I disagreed with personally or creatively, or because I disagree with it because the impact it's going to have on the team is probably the most common theme, especially when there's been a lot of change in a project. It feels like additional change is just going to hit the team one more time. We're going to lose that productivity. We're going to lose that momentum. And the way that I have dealt with that usually is by using the change as kind of a case study. So basically, I've often been in a situation where I'm not empowered enough to push back on executive decision making, and I really just have to roll with the decisions that they're already making. But what I can do is collect as much information as possible to build a really powerful case against future decisions like this, basically, to be able to demonstrate the impact on the team through data, be able to demonstrate the impact on the project, and basically just working around using it as an opportunity to collect data and make our processes better in the future.